Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Today we are talking what's missing from English literature at school. Emotion. It is The Conversation article written by Marcello, Giovanelli and Megan Mansworth. They join me today. They're on the panel. We're here to talk about it. And we'll do some introductions first, guys, if that's okay. We'll start with you, Marcello.
Hi, so I'm a senior lecturer in English language and literature, and I'm also head of the Department of English Languages and Applied Linguistics.
And Megan?
Hi, I'm a teaching fellow in English language and literature here at Aston.
Perfect. Okay. Well, what was the reason to begin with for actually writing the article in the first place?
Well,
who wants to go first? Go on, Marcello. Go on.
I mean, it really came from some research that we thought about a while ago. Now we're both from teaching backgrounds. Actually, both Meg and I were school teachers before we came into higher education, and we've always maintained an interest in reading and literature in schools. And a few years ago, we became interested in emotion. Meg's doctoral research actually is on emotion in literature, and we were interested in how teachers perceive the value of emotion in literature teaching. So, to what extent do they rely on their own emotions and the emotions of students as they plan for lessons? And this is in the context of a sort of changing curriculum, really, over the last 5 or 6 years, where personal responses have kind of been downplayed, certainly in the exam system. So we're interested in what value teachers still gave to emotions, really. And so we undertook a project where we surveyed. We got about 140 responses, and we got some really interesting data from that. And so the conversation article really just sort of touches on one aspect of that data. And we've still got the other parts to look at, actually. So that's another task. So yeah, it stems from a sort of ongoing interest in literary reading and the way in which literature is framed in schools, and also at policy level as well.
Megan, it says in the article that it's the opening line, reading fiction is an emotional experience. You've highlighted some research from the National Literacy Trust in there as well, which is a UK charity, and nearly 45% of children and young people said reading made them feel better. Do you think that figure is lower than you expect it to be and lower than you would want it to be?
Yeah, well, in terms of lower than you'd want it to be, yeah, I suppose the more students that are able to develop an emotional connection with literature, to feel emotions based on their reading, then we might suppose then that will have a knock-on positive effect when they do. So, but I think the interesting thing really is around some of this difference between reading for pleasure and reading in the classroom, and how those sometimes get separated and compartmentalized. So we tend to find students seeing reading in the classroom and teachers framing reading in the classroom due to the pressures of the curriculum and other factors in quite a different way to reading outside the classroom. So we tend to find that students have this quite different viewpoint around that type of reading, and that sometimes the reading for pleasure that students might experience outside of that environment gets separated from classroom reading. So so a lot of teachers talk about as well how they like to bring emotion into the classroom, and how they do see reading for pleasure, but also the emotional experience of reading as important. So we found that came up repeatedly in our research. But at the same time, there's this tension whereby teachers aren't able to explore emotions around reading and to look at reading from that emotional angle as much as they'd like to, because partly of the way in which it's framed in the curriculum.
Marcello, we've got an impersonal approach here, and I think probably most people can recall what they did at GCSE English literature. If they did it, I don't think mine was sort of Beowulf and Of Mice and Men. Actually, I think I did an Inspector Calls as well, which is something you've highlighted in the article, but I can't remember whether it was theatre studies, darling, or whether it was English literature. It was one of them, but I definitely do remember doing it. But what do you mean by an impersonal approach? I mean, with the Inspector Calls reference here, you say a recent GCSE paper asked students, how does Priestley explore the importance of social class in An Inspector Calls? So questions like this prompt students to consider the intention and style of the author without taking their personal response to the text into account. It seems like that old joke, doesn't it? It says, the room is blue. What does the author mean? Oh, it means it's cold and it's very emotional and dark and dreary. And the answer is no, the author thinks it's blue. But obviously, just outside of that bit, what does it mean by an impersonal approach?
I think it means just that. Exam questions sort of ask students to engage in a curious sort of kind of telepathy, really. You know, can you read the author's mind? And I mean, there's a whole stack of research in literary studies which shows that's a really problematic way of thinking about, you know, what texts mean and the rest of it. I think by impersonal response we mean one which is detached from students' own connections with text. I think if you go back, and one of the things we did actually in the research was go back and look at exam papers from sort of, you know, 30, 40 years or so ago, and there was much more of an opportunity for students to respond to texts in ways that focused on how the text made them feel. You know, so questions might be, you know, read this poem. How does the language make you respond, or how do you feel about the themes and the ideas presented, and so on. And what we've got now is a very curious narrowing of examination questions that centre largely on authorial intention, and so, you know, downplay personal response and narrow the kinds of things that students can say. And what that really ends up being, of course, is that teachers as sort of authority figures in the classroom tend to, in some cases, impose meanings onto text and so on. You know, so what a text means is largely what a teacher says it means, and so forth. That's really difficult, and research has shown that can make students feel that English isn't for them. And we've seen that in the sort of decrease in numbers taking English at post-16, and of course into higher education, where numbers for the last 7, 8, 9 years have been falling as well. So this is part of a sort of a problem in the broader ecosystem of English, really. I'm not saying it all stems from examination questions, but it's a bigger part of a picture which has tried to you know, detach school English, as Meg says, from personal English or reading for pleasure at home. And we think the two should be better connected.
Meg, I know that you sort of mentioned An Inspector Calls there and that relationship. Do you think that the star of the show, as it were, should be the words on the page rather than the person that wrote them?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, that's a kind of perennial question in English. Really, the importance of the reader's response, and it's certainly something that we at Aston and at university level as well really centralise this idea of reader response and the importance of individual interpretation. But as you say, yes, sometimes I think partly due to the way the examination systems are framed, but also then the way that we try and prepare for them, and revision guides on every possible theme that might come up in a text, which is completely understandable and is a way to help students to meet those expectations. But what that can mean is that that we do engage in this guessing game about what the author intends, rather than what we might see as a more reader response driven form of English. And the benefit of that reader response form of English is that if we're thinking about the reader, then of course everyone has the ability to have an interpretation of a text, and you know, there not being one just way to look at a text, one right way. So that's really enabling for students as well, and helps them to develop that enjoyment and that personal emotional response too.
Marcello, if we look at it very, very simply, and if the question is, how does the text by Priestley make you feel? Can you technically get that answer wrong?
Well, yeah. I mean, there is. I suppose there are degrees of rightness and wrongness rather than absolutes. I mean, clearly, if you said An Inspector Calls is about, you know, my own experience of being at school or picking apples in a an orchard or something. It's not.
Where did you go to school?
Where did I go to school?
Picking apples in the orchard. There's a fantastic school.
I'm just trying to figure things out there. I mean, but often what a text means is how it's used by a reader, and readers do attach idiosyncratic meanings to text, and that's absolutely fine. We all do that. We all listen to a song lyric and connect it to our own lives in some way. But we also try and probably contextualize that what you know about the writer and so on as well. So both are fine. I think what's happened, and what we've seen in research we've done, is that perhaps teachers feel that there's been a movement a bit more towards allowing and seeing that as somehow less rigorous, less and of course that's not the case at all. And I mentioned earlier, this is part of a bigger picture, really, a bigger context of what's happened in schools over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and in hand really with sort of fetishizing particular kinds of literary texts, such as canonical 19th century novels and poetry by certain authors and so forth, and downgrading others, and that's all part of this picture as well. So yeah, you can get things, again, English is the subject where you can't get things wrong if you state your opinion. There's a truth in that, but there's also that's also a bit of a stretch at times as well.
It was written, the article, back end of last year, and so it was a nice round number to 1921, 100 years ago, to that Newbolt report, which was a landmark educational review of the teaching of English in England. Just tell us a little bit about that, Megan, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, the Newbolt report, which was led by Sir Henry Newbolt in 1921, was really what we see as the first real attempt to, from a governmental perspective, really, to look at and attempt to shape the teaching of English in England. And that's what it's subtitled, The Teaching of English in England. And it was on the part of the Board of Education, really, this attempt to look at how English was taught and to attempt to comment on how it should be taught as well. So this bringing together of practice and this attempting to shape it as well. So of course we've seen that increase massively over the past 100 years. So it's really interesting to look at one of the key pieces of policy and one of the key places that it began, really. So it was a landmark in that sense. And it's really interesting in terms of the way in which we can see many of the ways that English is spoken about in the report. Actually, we see those echoed today. So we see a focus on areas of English that we still see today, but we also can see ways in which the teaching of English has changed as well. So arguably the focus on emotion and the emotional power of literature is something that, as we've spoken about in our research, has arguably sometimes been constrained or lost. And that's actually something that we find referenced repeatedly throughout that report. So it's really interesting in terms of contextualizing English now. And it was massively influential on the subsequent teaching of English too. Perfect.
Marcello, do you think that English literature may be able to fix politics in this country? Because I think it's the second paragraph that it says the emotions we feel when reading may even help us show empathy, understand that others have an opinion, and encourage us to help others too. You may well have just fixed politics.
Maybe, yeah. I'm not sure it can prevent people from lying. But
no, that's very true. It sets a precedent, doesn't it?
There you go. I mean, there was a story in the press a few weeks ago. I can't remember the exact details, but I'm sure a judge prescribed some literature to a criminal. I can't remember what it was, but it was
quite a serious crime, actually, wasn't it? From memory, I'm trying to think what that was. It a shooting?
It may have been. Yeah.
It was in America. Was it in America?
I think.
Here. Was it here? Was it?
I think it was. Yeah.
Sorry, carry on. I'll try and find a link and put it in the description.
But I think it was something like go and read George Eliot. So again, you sort of fall back to the sort of old favourites. But we say, I mean, there is research which has shown that young people who read develop better pro-social behaviour. that they think of others more, largely because when we engage with literature, we kind of run a kind of simulation. We enter a literary world, we enter characters, their motivations, their goals, and so on, and we take those on, and we experience those as our own, and that can lead us to sort of pull back into the external world and empathize better. And studies have shown that, particularly around young children. So there's an importance to that, certainly, in encouraging reading. Whether that can help 50-something politicians, who knows? But it could certainly
maybe English literature is the key rather than classics. That could be the reason. There's a quote in here, Megan, from one teacher. I mean, you said teachers use the words feel and feelings, which I think they're just woke words at the moment, aren't they? In some forms of the media, but they're obviously quite important and they work. He says, I find the easiest way into getting kids to analyze language is getting them to think about how it makes them feel, and then to explore the language is making that happen. I take it that's something that you agree with.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of comes back quite nicely to what Marcello was saying earlier about how there's a spectrum of individual interpretation, a really wide spectrum, and which can be valid, because essentially what you're doing there is you're asking students to talk about how they feel about the language, which means that their interpretation is grounded in something. So they're using the language to really evidence those feelings and say, this is what makes me feel like that. So it's a way of privileging the reader's individual interpretation, but still ensuring, I think, there that they are basing it on something. So I think that's actually a really useful approach, and it brings together language and literature as well in a really useful way too.
Marcello, what's the one thing that maybe has to change with the curriculum? You've highlighted that some teachers felt the curriculum assessment system prohibited personal and emotional connections with text. So what's sort of first base in terms of the home run of turning it around?
That's a really interesting question, because it just depends where you stand, doesn't it? Politically, ideologically, pedagogically, so my response here will simply be a personal one. But I would like to see a better connection between personal reading and school reading. I think we've made things far too difficult in a way for young people by expecting them to be mini academics when they're 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they're not. We in higher education don't want that. We don't want sort of mini academics with very narrow viewpoints coming onto our courses. We want students who enjoy reading and have been given a love of reading in school. And I think the curriculum needs to diversify. I think we need more text from a wider range of authors. We need a better examination system that tests personal response. There are lots of teachers and organisations out there doing really good stuff anyway. So organisations like the English and Media Centre, for example, are always promoting really good ways of working in schools and so on. And there's a whole tradition as well of more reader-oriented pedagogies and practices going right back to the 70s and 80s that we seem to have lost a little bit now. And I think that's really happened in the last 9 or 10 years, where we've had a shift in government, but also a shift in how literature is seen and valued in schools. So I'd like to be a bit more inclusive and a bit more realistic about what we want with young people and reading, and we don't want sort of mini academics necessarily.
Cheating you out of a job, weren't they? At 13, we can't be having that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. But it's a tough one, because for some it's all fine, and we accept that, and no stance is ever neutral. But some of the things that we've seen in our research suggest that certainly young people are being put off reading, and that's the crucial thing for us, and all the research that shows the value of reading and the importance of reading, and it part of that must be because of what's happening in schools, and that's certainly not teachers' fault.
Megan, does this sort of thing ebb and flow? Because I know it was only a couple of years ago that there was a huge drive to get more people and more women in general actually into STEM subjects, and a lot of onus was put on going into STEM. You know, you can earn loads of money going into STEM. We'll give you bursaries to go and learn at university, etc. Is it something that just does go up and down with the way that the country needs, I suppose, talent?
I'm not sure whether that has a direct impact on the teaching of the subject itself, but it certainly has an impact on things like the university numbers sometimes, and sometimes the devaluing of English as a subject, potentially. So that's perhaps a broader issue. Although yeah, I think there is I suppose there is a danger that sometimes where the English might be, you know, sometimes depending on your positioning, sometimes there might be an attempt to almost make it more similar to STEM subjects in attempting to create this perhaps tick box of things that you need to include in an answer and things like that. So I suppose if you're thinking on a school level, then I'm not sure what the impact of that could be. So I think that's perhaps a different piece of research, which is interesting though. But definitely on a broader level, the kind of the focus on STEM. Of course, you know, STEM's really important as an area, but I think that sometimes the way in which recruitment for STEM can be framed, or has been sometimes framed, could potentially be a broader issue that contributes to that recruitment into universities, which is a shame because English leads to a huge variety of different employment roles, different job types. So it certainly isn't something that's not incredibly useful in that sense as well. So yeah, so perhaps slightly broader.
And just finally, just before we wrap up, the article finishes, Marcello, if students do not find studying English literature stimulating, they may be deterred from continuing to study the subject beyond GCSE. Fewer students are studying A-level English. So just before we go, what's the best advert that you can give? And Megan, I'll come to you to sort of give your thoughts on that as well, that you can give for doing just that.
For carrying on studying English?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, to answer that, I'm going to just come back to a point that Meg made about sort of STEM, and it's we've seen in the last 2 years that science isn't enough actually. You know, the skills and knowledge that arts and humanities subjects give you are absolutely crucial. You know, empathy, communication skills, the ability to think, to problem solve, all of those things. And we've seen during the pandemic that just science isn't enough to get people through. So I would say English is a very applied subject. It's absolutely valuable for you know, the real world, for external problems, for outward facing problems. As we've discussed earlier, reading literature really does promote empathy. It kind of hits you in ways, allows you to see cultures, situations, events that might be outside of your immediate scope, and therefore enriches your life. And you know, we want more people to read, because we know that it's not just good for you know, personal well-being, but it has tangible benefits to the wider community and so forth as well.
And Megan, just finally, I know you touched on a couple of points previously, but just to round us off.
Oh, on the same question, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think I can put it any better than Marcello has, really. I just completely agree. You know, I think that valuing one subject, one area of knowledge doesn't mean that we should denigrate another. And you know, as Marcello said, science, STEM isn't enough. We need what English brings, and we need that as you know, an aspect of not just learning in schools, but also in higher education, and the wealth of different skills it can bring, and what it does for students as individuals is incredible, really. So yeah, as Marcello says, that's another reason why we think reading is so vital, beginning there at that level in schools.